In 1511, the governor of the holy city of Mecca put a drink on trial. His name was Khair Beg, say it Khair Beg, and he was the city's market inspector. He assembled a council of jurists, produced physicians as witnesses, and had them formally declare a certain beverage forbidden. Coffee houses were shut. Beans were burned in the street. The drink was not wine. It was not a narcotic. It was roasted beans and hot water. His fear was very specific, and history would prove him right. It was not the drink he was afraid of. It was the room the drink created. Because wherever people sat down to drink coffee, they stayed, and they talked. And in a world run by men who preferred their subjects quiet, a room full of alert, talking people was the most dangerous thing imaginable. Over the next 400 years, a pope would be begged to ban it, an English king would try to crush it, and revolutionaries in 3 countries would plot in the haze of it. They would all discover the same thing Khair Beg discovered in 1511. You cannot ban a good idea once people are awake enough to have it. But the story doesn't start in Mecca. It starts 1,000 years earlier, in the highland forests of Ethiopia, with a plant nobody drank. High in the cloud forests of southwestern Ethiopia, in a region called Kaffa, which may be where the word coffee itself comes from, a wild evergreen bush grew red cherries with a hard seed inside. Today, we call that seed a coffee bean. For most of human history, nobody brewed it. The people who first understood it were the Oromo, say it Romo, of the Ethiopian highlands. And they did not drink coffee, they ate it. By most accounts, they ground the cherries together with animal fat and rolled them into dense energy balls, a food that warriors and travelers carried on long journeys, because it did something no ordinary food did. It kept you going. It kept you awake. A handful of it could carry a man through a march that should have finished him. Think of what that actually is. Long before anyone wrote the word caffeine, people had identified a plant that overrides the body's demand for rest, and they weaponized it, literally, as fuel for warriors. The stimulant came first. The beverage came much later. The famous legend, the one you may have heard, is that a goat herd named Kaldi noticed his goats dancing with strange energy after eating the red cherries, and tried them himself. It is a lovely story. It is also almost certainly a myth. It did not appear in writing until 1671, more than 800 years after it supposedly happened. History rarely comes with a goat herd. It usually comes with a trade route, and the trade route ran across the Red Sea. Sometime before the 1500s, the coffee plant crossed from Ethiopia into Yemen, and it was in Yemen that coffee, as we know it, was actually born, because the Ethiopians gave the world the plant. The Yemenis gave the world the drink. In the Sufi monasteries of the Yemeni mountains, holy men brewed the roasted seed into a hot, bitter, black beverage for one precise purpose: to stay awake through long nights of prayer and remembrance. They called it kahwa, say it kahwa, a word that had previously meant wine. They had found a wine that sharpened the mind instead of clouding it. For the Sufis, coffee was not a pleasure, it was a tool of devotion. But a drink that keeps you alert and clear does not stay in the monastery for long. By the early 1400s, people were drinking it in the Yemeni port of Aden. From there, it climbed the trade roads north, to Mecca, to Cairo, to Damascus. And everywhere it arrived, it did something that had genuinely never happened before in these cities. It created a new kind of building. Not a temple, not a market, not a palace. A place whose entire purpose was for ordinary people to sit, drink, and talk. The coffee house had been born, and it was about to make every government on earth nervous. To understand why a cafe frightened emperors, you have to understand what it replaced. In the old world, ordinary people gathered in exactly two kinds of places: houses of worship and drinking houses. In one, you were expected to be silent and obedient. In the other, you were drunk. Neither produced organized political thought, which suited the people in charge perfectly. The coffeehouse was something new and dangerous, a place where you were sober, awake, sharpened by caffeine, surrounded by strangers, and expected to talk. In Ottoman cities, they were called kahvehane, and men gathered in them to play chess, hear poetry, trade news, and argue about the powerful. That is what Kaya Beg saw in 1511, and that is why he banned it. His ban failed within a couple of years. Higher authorities in Cairo overruled him, but he had correctly identified the pattern, and the same fight would replay across the world for the next 2 centuries. Coffee arrives, people gather, rulers panic, rulers lose. When coffee reached Europe through Venetian traders in the late 1500s, Christian clergymen recoiled from this Muslim drink and pressed for it to be banned as satanic. The matter, by most accounts, went all the way to Pope Clement VIII, who was asked to condemn it. According to the story, he tasted it first, found it delicious, and joked that it would be a shame to let only the infidels have it, so he would baptize it instead. Whether the quip is exact or not, the outcome is documented. The church did not condemn coffee, and coffee houses spread across Europe like a fever. In England, they became known as penny universities. For the price of 1 penny, the cost of a cup, any man could walk in, sit down, and join a conversation with merchants, scientists, writers, and philosophers he would never otherwise have met. Specific coffee houses became specific institutions. One, run by a man named Edward Lloyd, filled with sailors and shipowners swapping shipping news, and grew into the insurance market Lloyd's of London, which still exists today. Another cluster became the heart of the stock trade. The scientific society that Isaac Newton would lead argued its ideas in them. A cup of coffee was, quite literally, the entry ticket to the modern world's first information networks. And that was exactly the problem, as far as the crown was concerned. In 1675, King Charles II of England issued a proclamation to shut down every coffee house in the country. He called them hotbeds of sedition, places that produced, in the language of the order, evil and dangerous effects. The most powerful man in England tried to close the cafes because he was frightened of what men said inside them. The public backlash was so immediate and so fierce that the king backed down in a matter of days. He had learned Kaya Beg's lesson 160 years later, in a different country, in a different language. Once a nation is awake and talking, you cannot switch it off by decree. The coffee house had beaten a governor and a king. Soon, it would help bring down something much larger. By the 1700s, Europe was changing the way it thought, and it was doing a great deal of that thinking in coffee houses. Historians have a name for the transformation: the Enlightenment, the age when reason, science, and political argument began to erode the old certainties of throne and altar. And it is not a coincidence that this age of clear-headed argument arrived alongside the continent's switch from a mildly drunk population to a caffeinated one. For centuries, Europeans had drunk weak beer and watered wine through much of the day because the water was unsafe. A person was rarely fully sharp and rarely fully drunk, just softly blurred all day long. Coffee and tea cut through that fog. A civilization quite literally sobered up. And the sober were harder to govern. In Paris, the cafes became the nervous system of a revolution. Men gathered under their awnings to read the pamphlets, argue the politics, and rage at the monarchy. On the 12th of July, 1789, a young writer named Camille Desmoulins, say it Camille Desmoulins, leapt onto a table outside the Café de Foix, drew a pistol, and called the crowd to arms. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. The French Revolution did not begin in a palace or a parliament. A crucial spark of it was struck on a café table by a man high on the atmosphere of the room. The same pattern had already played out across the Atlantic. In the American colonies, tea was the drink of the British Crown, and after the Boston Tea Party, drinking coffee instead of taxed British tea became something close to a patriotic act. The men who argued out the American Revolution did it, in no small part, over coffee. A Boston coffeehouse, called the Green Dragon, was later nicknamed the headquarters of the revolution. The drink Khair Beg had feared for creating dangerous conversations had become the official beverage of a new republic built on them. Coffee had earned its title. It genuinely helped fuel revolutions because it created the rooms where revolutions were argued into existence, and it kept the arguers awake long enough to win. But here the story turns, and it turns very dark, because all of this, the penny universities, the Enlightenment salons, the revolutionary cafes, depended on a supply of coffee large enough and cheap enough for ordinary people to drink it by the gallon. And in the 1700s, there was only one way to produce a tropical crop on that scale. For centuries, the coffee trade had been a jealously guarded monopoly. The Ottomans and the Yemeni port of Mecca controlled the supply, and to protect it, they reportedly parboiled or dried the beans before export, so that no fertile seed could ever be planted elsewhere. It worked for a while. Then, around 1616, Dutch traders managed to smuggle live coffee plants out to greenhouses in Holland. A little later, according to tradition, a pilgrim named Baba Budan, say it Baba Budan, hid 7 fertile coffee seeds against his body and carried them out of Arabia to India, breaking the monopoly for good. Once the living plant was loose in the world, the European empires did to coffee exactly what they had done to sugar. They took it to the tropics they controlled. They cleared the land, and they filled it with the enslaved. The drink of freedom in Europe was about to be grown by people who had none. The most valuable coffee colony on earth was a French island in the Caribbean called Saint-Domingue. Say it, Saint-Domingue, the western half of the island that is Haiti today. If that name sounds familiar, it should. It is the same island and the same system that produced the sugar in an earlier chapter of this series, because the plantations grew both. By the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue was producing, by most estimates, well over half of all the coffee consumed in the entire world. One French colony. More than half the planet's coffee. And it ran on human beings. The coffee in the enlightened cafes of Paris, the cups on the tables where men wrote about the natural rights of all mankind, was grown, picked, and processed by enslaved Africans, working under a regime so lethal that the population could not sustain itself. The death rate was so high that the plantations required a constant stream of new captives shipped across the Atlantic simply to replace the ones the work destroyed. The philosophers of liberty were drinking the product of absolute bondage, and most of them never connected the cup to the chain. The two ends of coffee had become impossibly far apart. At one end, a man in Paris, using the drink to help him argue that all men are born free. At the other, a woman on a Caribbean mountainside, enslaved, harvesting the beans that paid for his cup. Same plant, same trade, opposite worlds. Then, in 1791, the Second World rose up and destroyed the First. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue launched the revolution that would become the only successful large-scale slave revolt in modern history, the Haitian Revolution. They burned the plantations. The coffee estates that had fed the cafes of Europe went up in smoke, along with the sugar. When the fighting was over, and Haiti stood as a free nation, the world's largest coffee producer had simply erased itself from the map of the trade. The cafes of Europe, which had helped inspire the language of liberty that the Haitians turned against their masters, suddenly found their coffee supply gone. And the empires did what empires do. They moved the whole brutal system somewhere else and made it bigger. That somewhere was Brazil. Over the 1800s, Brazil became the coffee giant of the world, and it built that position on the largest slave economy in the Americas. Brazil imported enormous numbers of enslaved Africans, a great many of them driven into the coffee valleys, and it became the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery, holding on until 1888. For a full century, the world's morning cup was, overwhelmingly, a product of forced labor. The drink that Europe celebrated as the fuel of reason and freedom was, at the same time, one of the great engines of human bondage on earth. Both of those things are true at once. That is the whole uncomfortable truth of coffee. The same cup that funded the Enlightenment funded the auction block. And it still had not finished remaking the world. The 19th century turned coffee from a colonial luxury into an industrial necessity. The same revolution that filled cities with factories filled those factories with workers who needed to be awake, alert, and standing at a machine for 12 or 14 hours. Coffee, hot, cheap, stimulating, was the perfect fuel for the industrial shift, exactly as it had once been the perfect fuel for the Sufis' nightly prayers and the warriors' long march. The same property kept surfacing in every age. Coffee lets human beings override their own exhaustion and keep working. Every era simply found a new use for that power. In the United States, coffee became something close to a national identity. The Boston Tea Party had made tea politically distasteful. The vast waves of immigration and the westward expansion made coffee the drink of the worker, the soldier, and the pioneer. During the American Civil War, coffee was so prized by soldiers that some rifles were manufactured with a small grinder built into the stock, and the ration of coffee beans was, for many men, the most valued item they carried. And then came the 20th century, and coffee did the same thing sugar did. It drowned the world. Brazil grew so much coffee that it periodically produced more than the world could drink, and prices crashed. At one point, the Brazilian government burned or dumped enormous quantities of surplus beans, destroying millions of bags to prop up the price. Instant coffee, invented and then perfected across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, stripped the drink down to a spoonful of powder and a mug of hot water, and carried it into every kitchen and every trench. Coffee traveled with soldiers through both world wars. The word for a work break in much of the world, the coffee break, was formalized in the 20th century as industry realized and openly advertised that a caffeinated worker was a more productive worker. Notice the pattern, because it has never once changed. The Oromo warrior, the Sufi mystic, the Enlightenment philosopher, the factory hand, the soldier, the office worker at 3 in the afternoon, every single one of them reached for the same bean for the same reason. To borrow energy the body did not want to give. Coffee is, and has always been, a way of spending tomorrow's alertness today. By the late 20th century, a second coffeehouse revolution arrived, the global cafe chain, and it sold, more than anything, the original product Kair Beg had feared in 1511. Not just the drink, but the room. A public place to sit and work and talk. 500 years later, the world paid premium prices for exactly the thing a governor of Mecca had once tried to ban. The cafe had gone from a threat to civilization, to the symbol of it. Today, coffee is one of the most valuable and most traded commodities on the planet, and by many measures, the most popular drink on Earth, after water. Humanity drinks well over 2 billion cups of it every single day. It is grown across more than 70 countries, in a band around the equator known as the Coffee Belt, and the livelihoods of an estimated 100 million or more people depend on it. Most of them small farmers, many of them earning very little for a crop that generates enormous wealth further up the chain. The drink that ran on slavery for a century did not fully escape its shadow when slavery ended. The gap between the person who grows the bean and the person who drinks it has remained one of the widest in global trade, which is the entire reason the fair trade movement was invented for coffee in the first place. Consider the scale of a single modern number. Brazil, the country that once burned its surplus to control the price, still grows roughly a third of the world's coffee, more than a century after abolition. The plantation geography the slave empires drew is, in large part, still the map of coffee today. Vietnam, which barely grew coffee before the late 20th century, deliberately turned itself into the world's second largest producer as a matter of national policy, in a single generation. A drink that took 1,000 years to travel from an Ethiopian forest to a Yemeni monastery now reshapes entire national economies within decades. And the oldest use of all is still the real one. Strip away the romance, the branding, and the ritual, and coffee remains exactly what it was to the aroma warrior, a chemical that pushes back the moment your body wants to stop. We have built a global, trillion-cup civilization on the simple biological trick that a wild Ethiopian shrub happened to evolve to protect its seeds. And we reach for it, most of us, before we have even fully woken up. Scientists now study caffeine as the most widely consumed psychoactive substance in human history. Not one of the most. The most. Billions of people begin every single day by taking a mild, legal, socially mandatory stimulant and have organized their work, their mornings, and their social lives around it so completely that a day without it gives them a genuine withdrawal headache. Khair Beg looked at a cup of coffee in 1511 and saw a threat to public order. He had absolutely no idea how right he was, or how completely he had already lost. So let us count what this one bean did. It began as a warrior's food in the Ethiopian highlands and a monk's aid to prayer in the mountains of Yemen. It built a new kind of room, the coffeehouse, that frightened a governor, defied a pope, and beat a king. It sobered up a drunk continent and helped power the Enlightenment. It sat on the tables where the American and French revolutions were argued into being, and at the very same time, it was grown by the enslaved on Caribbean and Brazilian plantations, so brutal that they consumed human lives by the 100,000. The same island, the same chains, the same fires as sugar. One bean built the language of freedom and the machinery of bondage in the same century out of the same cup. That is the deep contradiction at the bottom of your morning mug. Coffee is the drink of the awake, of the thinker, the arguer, the rebel, the worker who will not stop. It has spent 1,000 years on the side of human beings who were trying to do more than their rulers wanted them to do. And it has spent much of that same 1,000 years being produced by human beings who were given no freedom at all. Both are true. The cup does not choose. It only keeps you awake, and what you do while awake has always been the entire point. Khair Beg was right about one thing. Standing in Mecca 500 years ago, a room full of people drinking coffee really is dangerous to anyone who wants them quiet. He just made one mistake. He thought he could close the room. Instead, the room spread to every city on earth, and the world now drinks 2 billion cups a day inside it. The next time you hold a coffee, the cheapest, most ordinary jolt in your entire day, remember that it is the same chemical a warrior carried into battle, the same one a monk prayed on, the same one a revolutionary stood on a table to shout through. You are not drinking a comfort. You are drinking the most successful stimulant in the history of the species, and it is still doing the one thing it has always done, keeping you awake, so you can decide what to do about it. If this story kept you up, the history of the other great morning ritual, the bean's ancient rival, and the plant Britain fought a war and stole a country to control, is the history of tea, and it is waiting for you on screen right now. Go and pour the next one.